Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar organized by EUD. And today's topic is best practices supporting deaf victims of domestic violence. Today is the International Day of Stopping Domestic Violence Against Women and Girls. So today is a very important day. So we have chosen to focus our EUD webinar today on this very subject, how we can support deaf victims of domestic violence. There are many deaf women in Europe that have experienced either physical and or sexual violence. And they are dealing with this, and many have not been able to share this with anyone, and they keep it inside, and they suffer from this violence and abuse. So we want to focus our webinar today on how we can specifically support deaf women to come out, to process the abuse, to seek help, to seek services that can support them to overcome this abuse that they've endured. Many deaf women are not able to access services due to communication. The sign for the international sign for abuse is different. Today you're gonna see a few different signs for the exact sign for violence or the word for violence. Of course, there are many different ways of how someone endures or suffers from domestic violence, but we're going to look at this on a wider perspective. We have when you see the work today, we actually do have a working group. We have one working group that has come together specifically to look at supporting victims of domestic violence. So we do not have any standard signs for the international signs today. So please bear with us for the different signs you will see. Today's webinar will be in international sign, and it will be interpreted into spoken English, and it will also be subtitled. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Louise Danielson, and people call me Lolo. I am an EUD board member. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here for a second. Also want to talk about how the European Institute for Gender Equality has brought up different issues. But we also want to look at this in the deaf perspective. So we encourage national deaf associations to look at the gender equality issue within their own country. So please look within your national associations of the deaf and ensure that deaf women and girls that are victims of domestic violence are afforded the best levels of support as victims. EUD in 2018 had a European forum in Spain, in Valencia, for women that have suffered domestic violence and people working with women that have suffered, deaf women in different areas of the EU. But we all came together looking at different types of abuse that deaf women have suffered, deaf women and girls. This was a very important forum that we all attended because we were able to come together and share best practices. However, this happened within a vacuum. We came together, but we noticed when we came together, there is definitely not enough data looking at the situation for deaf women and girls in Europe. Since 2018, there has not been much more activity on the matter. And so we want to bring this up again. And when we looked, according to the European Institute for Gender Equality, they have found that 1 in 3 women have experienced either physical and or sexual violence within the EU. 1 in 3 women. That is quite a high percentage. And now we need to think, when you look at women and girls with a disability, are the numbers higher? Unfortunately, we don't have satisfactory statistics, and we need to make sure that we look further into the matter in Europe to make sure we can support women and girls. And therefore, EUD would like to support a survey and making sure we can further support deaf women and girls all through Europe. We are looking at a series of workshops and ways that we can support this within EUD. We will touch on that more later. I'd now first like to show a video on one project that EUD is involved in that is called Justice Signs 2. EUD is very happy to be involved in this extremely important project. After this video, we will have 2 speakers. We have 2 guest speakers today, 1 woman from Spain and 1 woman from France. And then we will close with a question and answer period. I would now like you to see the video of our project Justice Signs 2.
Hello, everyone. My name is Goodell, and I work here at the EUD. The European Union of the Deaf has a new project, and we're calling this new project Justice Signs 2. To tell you what this project is about, well, it focuses on gender violence, gender-based violence and education, advocacy services, and increasing access. And we do this by disseminating information and giving trainings and increasing general awareness of these issues. We focus on 2 different groups within this project. Gender-based violence, the victims that go through this experience, deaf victims as well as non-deaf victims. And for the non-deaf victims, we focus on immigrants and refugees. For those people whose first language isn't the language of the country that they're in. The second group of people that we focus on within this project are people that work within or will interact with victims and survivors of domestic violence. So people that work at hospitals, counselors, the police force, various people that will run into women and children who have been victims. Justice Signs 2 is happening amongst these partners who are participating and supporting this project. Now, EUD's role within Justice Signs 2 is information dissemination throughout our network of associations. So we work with these associations to provide the information that's gathered through the project. We also work with interpreters to increase their awareness of this topic as well, and generally network throughout the EU and various institutions throughout Europe, and organize and various organizations to show support. The EU institutions have provided funding for language access. The EU is responsible for dissemination of this information throughout Europe, again, as I've said before, to increase awareness on the topic. Secondly, interpreting services and educating interpreters in general about domestic violence issues. And as I mentioned before, the overall network throughout Europe to support the victims and survivors of this violence. And then other various services that the EU is providing funding for to make sure that they're linguistically accessible. The project has several goals. One of them being to offer support to domestic violence victims, interpreting training, whether it's sign language interpreters or spoken language interpreters. Also providing support and education to people working in various sectors, whether it be policing, border patrol, counseling services, education. And then we also offer online training and a general guide on what to do if you are experiencing domestic violence.
Thank you, Gudula, for explaining about the Justice Science 2 project. Once again, an extremely important project, and EUD is very happy to be involved in this project. National deaf associations will be able to benefit from the information that we will collect in this project. Currently, many deaf women and girls that are deaf have so many communication issues. They'd like to express themselves. They would like to have redress. However, they're trying to find out how they can even get this information or communicate. Luckily, we have two guests that will be sharing the best practices on how we can support deaf women that have been victims of domestic violence. Our first presenter today is Alba Prado. This is her sign name. And she will be talking to us from the perspective from Spain. And she is the Gender Equality Officer from the Spanish National Confederation of Deaf People. And she will be sharing their experiences on how they support deaf victims. You have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Europe. And thank you, Lolo. And thank you to EUD for having me here today. This topic is quite broad, but I'll be talking specifically about the work that we've been doing in Spain within the Confederation of the Deaf. Now, the Confederation was established quite a long time ago, and we've done many things over the years related to health and human rights, specifically for the human rights of deaf people, accessibility, and done a lot of education in regards to accessibility and legislation, lots of different topics. But I haven't been working on all those topics myself. Within Spain, we have 17 local areas which have their own federations of the deaf. And within them, they have their own smaller area associations of the deaf. So we all work within the Confederation for the Deaf in Spain. So there's a lot of work being done in various areas throughout the country. Later, I'll talk more about why. So the sign that we use for our Confederation is this one. And the field that I work on is gender equality. And within gender equality, there's a lot of various topics as well: advocacy, policy, legislation, working with the government, working with the private sector, working with other fields of disability, and working on empowerment for deaf women. The government also has a lot of obligation in providing access to deaf women. So one thing I wanted to say is that, and as Lolo already mentioned this, we had the first forum in Europe for deaf women in 2018, and it was such an important event. All the topics that we covered at this event were imperative as well. So thank you, Lolo, for that. So working on gender equality, currently our Confederation is looking at different ways and how we can encourage this. Gender equality specifically looking at diversity, and that's critical because deaf women are not all the same, right? And deaf people are not all the same. Some people are born deaf, some people lose their hearing later in life, some deaf people use sign language, some don't. Some have multiple languages. They come in all different shapes and sizes, and then that needs to be respected when considering policies and how to provide access. Now, gender equality, how it functions within the deaf community is quite the same, right? There's a lot of different diverse topics and actions and advocacy venues that we can take. Specifically, when we think about violence, we must put that at the forefront of our fight for gender equality. We cannot forget the survivors of this, the people that are currently going through that. So from 1994 until now, we haven't seen a lot of cases about gender violence that are being spoken about or being prosecuted. And as I mentioned before, within the Confederation, there's regional areas that are looking at these different issues and looking at the victims and how we can support these victims, right? How do we support these women who have gone through these experiences? They're not isolated incidents. So our team has expanded in being able to provide the support. And the way that we've done that is by offering a service called ALBA. And this is a sign that we use for that. And the reason for that being is that here in Spain, the Spanish word ALBA means the morning sun, right? The first crack of sunlight in the morning, right? The positivity for the day, the brightness for the day. And that's what we call this as well. And what we want our victims to experience, some brightness in their lives. Right? So when a woman experiences violence, she's sort of, euphemistically gone into the dark, and she's going through a very dark hour. And we want her to experience the sense of Alba, which means that she's seeing a way out of the abuse that she's experiencing. And we can, through our various services, provide that to these women who are victims of domestic violence. There's various foundations that support the Confederation, and those funds can go to supporting various projects looking at this. So we're able to get these grants to support deaf female victims. So the government also acknowledges that grants need to be given as well. So I'm hoping that you can see the message below, which should have the website. I'm looking for it. Maybe they'll pop it up soon. There it is. There's the website. Thank you. So this website is a resource for people. We use LSE, Spanish Sign Language. So people looking at this website can get the information that way. But it's also good for hearing women who are older, not just for deaf people. Women, we want to impart that women can break free from the experiences that they're going through, that there is a way out, that there's an alternative to what they're experiencing. So in the website, there's information about the various institutions. They define what violence is. They define how the steps that a person who's experiencing violence, what steps they could take to remove themselves from that situation. There's people for them to contact. If a victim needs to just talk about what they're going through, we offer counseling services for them as well. They can be provided through video chat via a deaf person who works at providing this service, which is often a relief to the deaf victims because they're then communicating with somebody who understands the deaf part of their lives, and it's much easier for them to communicate using sign language. We also have people from outside of Europe but have come here to live in Spain. So we can also provide international sign services in case they don't, in case they're not fluent in LSE. There's some people that don't know sign language at all. We can use text to offer them our support. And as a last resort, we can also use email to keep in touch with these women who are needing the support. We would never not support somebody because of their communication needs. We would find a way to accommodate them. There's also a phone number service, 915, which offers protection for victims of domestic violence. But for deaf people, they can't access that the same way. They use another program called S-Visual. So they go into this first program and it calls directly to a sign language interpreter who then accesses the 915 service that other people are able to access more directly. So there's multiple avenues for victims of domestic violence to seek help. Their community, their friends, and for people who might suspect somebody else of experiencing that violence, you can also contact us to ask us how to support people that you know who are being hurt. It could be a man who thinks, well, I'm a man. Why would this woman who's experiencing violence from another man want my support? But I'm here to say that you can support. And we can show you and guide you on how to do that. So we have professional people that work with victims, and if there's professional people that want to know how to work with deaf victims specifically, they can also come to us and we're happy to offer them guidance. Again, our website is our main resource. Violence against women and the prevention of that is the responsibility of all people in society, whether you can hear or not hear, you're a man or a woman. We can prevent domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Alba, for a wonderful presentation about how we can support deaf victims of domestic violence. It was great to hear that you provide so many services, and for quite a long time, since 1981. I believe the services from Alba are a great service that we can share with our European national associations. It's important that we also make sure that there's a contact person for a deaf victim. So it's great to see that you have provided different ways for deaf victims to get in contact for services. You mentioned that there are deaf women that are victims of domestic violence, but indeed, it is important that we all work together to prevent domestic violence. The European Institute for Gender Equality also looks at this, and there is also Article 9 and 13 of the UN CRPD that focuses on how we can support women and girls and gender violence. I'd now like to present our second presenter from France. Her name is Catherine Zlatkovic. This is her sign name. She is the honorary president of the Deaf Women Solidarity and Citizenship Foundation. And Catherine will further explain what their association does. You have the floor, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Lolo and thank you to Europe. This is the first time I've been on mass media. It is the 25th of November, and this is the day for preventing violence for women. I'm going to put on my other hat as a volunteer for the Deaf Women's Solidarity and Citizenship Association. This association is an association in France. The National Federation of France for the Deaf has their headquarters, and they have local associations, regional associations throughout France. And so we work under the National Federation of France for the Deaf. The Deaf Women's Solidarity and Citizenship Association provides a variety of services. We have a coffee time for women to come together. We provide different talks for either just women or for both men and women together. We also celebrate the World Day of the Deaf in March. We also are going to be celebrating today, looking at trying to stop violence for women and celebrating today on November 25th. And we actually have been around since 2003 until today. And we've been providing these large array of services for the deaf, but now today we're going to focus on a certain service that we provide. We are a voluntary association. We do not get government funding, but I'll explain how that works. We do have permanent locations, and these have been set up in 2006. Volunteers work within the association in the evening from 5 in the evening till 8. We have different offices that are open 2 times a week throughout the year. We also have a shelter for deaf women set up as well. So we have been working very hard for the last years, and we have heard many, many stories from deaf victims. So at our permanent locations, like I said, we have a support desk that we provide services that are very varied that I can explain. But the ones that I do want to highlight today are also services that we have for women that have been trafficked. So they have been brought here through from other men who have promised them a good life here. And unfortunately, they have no access for redress because they are not citizens of France. So we work specifically with this group, and we now finally have data that we have collected because we've been working on this for the last 4 years. So from 2006 to 2010, we have collected data on the services that we provide and roughly 134 victims that we have been able to support. We have now been able to work together with the housing boards that have accepted to give these women work in all different areas of life. We work together with interpreters, and for the last 3 years, we have been able to achieve many, many goals. However, we have to work together with the hearing community, and we've noticed that what the services that they need and the services that we need do differ, but we have been able to come to a compromise. And once we have been able to agree on which services that we have been able to provide, we've gotten some government funding. We do have 3 women that are now working within this certain support group. 1 woman that is deaf, that is works in legal firms and works for deaf women that are victims. And we also have 2 hearing professionals that work in education, but are fluent in sign language. So our association, during, of course, the COVID pandemic times, had to figure out how they could provide services to abused women. Because as we know, many women that were stuck in quarantine, the percentages of violence against women rose incredibly during the corona pandemic. We needed to find out how we could provide services. We did provide services through video call and video conferencing. We didn't have any training on how to do this whatsoever. We just had to spontaneously find a way on how we can still contact these women. And luckily they were able to share their situation and relieve themselves of the stress instead of keeping it in. We were able to provide services for 2 times in the morning, and also 2 periods in the afternoon, and also 2 periods in the evening. We had enough staff to staff these support hours. We also had 7 staff and support workers that were working around the clock to make sure that the deaf women and the victims had support and contact. We also were able to provide support 2 times a week. If you would like to know information, you can go into the website, and we have a lot of information that is in it is in sign language. It is in LSF, in Langue Signe Française, but we have a lot of information that is available for the deaf community. Secondly, we also have an email address where people can contact us if they want video conferencing or video support. And we also have the Partner Women's House in Paris Legal and Social Services. I was explaining how we don't receive any financial support from the government. So we have been lobbying very hard and working with the media, with internet services, with video conferencing services. But we needed to find a way to finance this all. Years ago, there was some monies available to support the youth from 16 to 30 years old. So we were able to staff our association with these youth for 6 months. They could have an internship with us so that they can gain experience that they could then draw upon in the future for their future work. Accessibility in France is not that great. They definitely do not have 100% access to all the services that are available. However, in France, they are trying to make sure that government services are more accessible. We have an accessibility, we have 114 here in France. In Europe, the emergency services is 112 in Europe. In France, we have 114. So we do have emergency services that are accessible through SMS. We have many different service numbers, and I will share that with you. But we have luckily been able to try and to make sure we can provide access for these services, but they're not all accessible. Right now we have video conferencing. People are able to now contact us in both sign language, SMS, real-time captioning, and also one-on-one. Unfortunately, there is not full coverage. Hospitals use sign language interpreters if they have an appointment with a deaf patient, but this is not nationwide. This happens only in certain areas, but there is no interpretation being provided for special services for women that have experienced abuse. And there are very few interpreting services available for these wider services that are provided from the government for the hearing community, but the deaf people have not been able to. So we hope to make sure that these are more accessible in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, for your wonderful explanation on what your association is working on. It's impressive to see that there has been so much work done, all on a voluntary basis. It's also great to see that there have been improvements, slowly but surely. You expressed that the coverage is unfortunately not at its ultimate yet, and that there are sometimes difficulties providing interpreting services for deaf victims, so there's more work that needs to be done. Once again, the UNCRPD Article 13 that talks about access to justice, hopefully you can also use that instrument to help your advocacy and your lobbying to make sure that there's more access to be able to support the deaf victims in France. It was also interesting to hear that during the Corona epidemic, you were able to work quite quickly and look for alternatives to be able to still provide services for the deaf victims. That is so great to hear. Thank you to both of our speakers today, both Alba and Catherine. EUD has been able to also collect these best practices, and we look forward to sharing these to the national associations of the deaf in Europe. And we look forward to being able to collect more best practices and see how we can continue this work in the future. We have now received some questions for our panelists. So let's move on to our question and answer period. Do we have our first question?
Do either of the presenters have any figures on how many deaf women in their country access support services? How big is the demand?
Who would like to take this?
I'm happy to. The current statistics in Spain focus on a couple different things. And it's not a complete set of data, but in terms of the victims who are experiencing the violence, it's reported by the various regions within Spain. So, but in terms of access to service via ALBA, we can say in 2018 until now, so just 2 years, there's been 25 individuals who have self-reported experiencing domestic violence in 2 years. I'm sure there's more, but they aren't reporting. The problem is that this topic is incredibly taboo. Taboo is rendered by society, and that taboo needs to be broken so that people can come forward about their experiences and then receive the support that they need. So the statistics aren't really reliable as such.
In regard to statistics in France, the volunteers working at our association, like myself, we have tallied personally. So we've done a local information gathering. So when we have provided services, we tally this up, and if we have a new person coming, and until now we have serviced since 2016 to 2010. And we have serviced 134 victims. Women that have taken work at the Women's House in Paris, they have hired three people there, and they have tallied that every year how many women they have been able to provide work for. And so they have collected data, but that data I don't know personally.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So the website that we provide, that I mentioned during my presentation, within 2 years, we've had 50% more, but not people just from Spain alone. We've had people from 90 different countries. So deaf people throughout the world need more information how they can access services. Because domestic violence is not only happening in Spain, it's happening all throughout the world. So we can see that there is a huge need there, and there needs to be more consideration for global provision of support.
Yes, we've also noticed that we need to make sure we can gather statistics from all different regions, bring this together so that we can have better insight on the situation. The EUD has also been looking at ways that we can collect proper statistics so we can prepare and see what type of support that we can provide for deaf victims. And if we have statistics, we can make sure that we can look for funding so that we can further support these support services financially. We need to start somewhere, but EUD definitely wants to look into a formal research or study to make sure we can provide the necessary statistics and data, because it's out there. We just need to make sure that we find a way to collect it. All right, next question.
Are there support groups of and for deaf women who have experienced gender-based violence in Spain or France?
Good question. Louis says, who would like to respond?
Catherine, you can respond first.
So when we're looking at peer support services, there is some support services or focus groups that's provided from the hearing community. However, again, it's not very accessible for the deaf because usually it's one hearing moderator. Then there's also a psychologist. And then there could be an interpreter that's available for the deaf participants. So we do have this service that's open for both the deaf and hearing victims. However, if I'm a deaf victim and I'm looking at the interpreter, but I'm not looking at the psychologist, or I don't have direct communication. I'm always communicating via an interpreter. However, the hearing victims also are then expressing themselves, but it's being interpreted. So it's third communication, and it's just not as inspiring or as moving for the deaf victims. As we all know, this is a situation that we experience in many different areas of our life. So we're trying to find out how can we provide direct peer support services. That's difficult to find out how to do that. Alba, would you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, the situation I have to say is quite similar, but I'd be happy to add to that. Support, now we think about support groups. Now, if it's an all deaf support group, that might work, but when you have a hearing people or hearing group meeting, it's different. So we think about the language, right? So if we have an interpreter in there with a deaf person as well, there's too many differences. So for hearing people, it seems to be okay. They can make a connection to their peers more easily than a deaf person would in that scenario. So I think going forward, we're definitely going to have to work on how to provide better services, but this has to do with education and advocacy, and talking about things that are happening within the deaf community and who's responsible for doing that. It can't always be the victim's responsibility to do education, and it's not just women that need to take accountability as well. Men do too. So the services that we provide, when you have a deaf victim and they meet a deaf facilitator or a deaf counselor, there's an immediate ease there because they can communicate and they share culture and shared experience, and that just puts the deaf victim at ease in being able to communicate. And they can express more easily what they're going through because the deaf person that they're speaking to has had a similar experience in terms of language and challenges that come with being a deaf person in society.
Yes, what you're both saying is that they need to have a shared language and a shared culture and a shared identity, and then they can be equal, at par with their hearing counterparts. That they can have someone that they could look into their eyes, and that they don't have to explain the background, that they know that they have that shared experience in the deaf community. And then they can receive support. And once they can express themselves, then they can go forward and they can see what other support services they will need, be it medical services, psychological services, or even maybe possibly needing to go to the police. And the deaf community can support each other best. And then, of course, if there needs to be an interpreter involved, that would be the next step. But maybe that's something that we can consider, is having, deaf-led support services. Let's go to the next question.
Can Catherine say more about the shelter? This seems to be pretty unique. She mentioned 134 victims earlier. Is that victims of trafficking or victims in general?
The 134 victims that I was talking about are victims from all different types of abuse. The highest percentage is trafficking. They have taken their identity, they've taken all of their passports and the like, so that they are, without any identification. So that's a huge situation. Another have had endured mental abuse, that they came here strong-willed and ready to face the world, and with so much mental abuse, they have just been crashed. And we wanted to make sure that we could note how many people we have been servicing to make sure we can get future funding. The Women's House for victims is increasing. However, it's not a shelter, it's actually a place where women can work. So people have come here from other countries. They don't have any papers here. They possibly don't have any diplomas. However, they are eager to work. For example, we also have two unfortunate situations of abuse to where it was fatal. Unfortunately, they died through their spouse. And due to communication issues, they were never they were never prosecuted because they were not able to go to court. They were not able to explain themselves, express themselves, go to the police and draw up proper evidence. So we need to also make sure we have a disaggregated data as well, because we have all different groups. And Lola is now saying, yes, it's very important that we document all of the different types of services that we're providing and the different types of victims that we are serving to make sure that we can have accurate types of support services, and also maybe look at possible funding that we could get. If you don't have the data to back up the services, as we see, it's not just one type of support services that are necessary. There are a wide range of services that are necessary for a wide range of unfortunate abuse cases. Alva, you'd like to share?
Yes. Earlier it was said that in Europe, 1 out of 3 women has experienced violence, physical violence, psychological violence, mental abuse. 1 out of 3, and I would venture to say it's more. In Spain, I would say 1 out of 2 have experienced a type of domestic abuse or violence. That's really significant. For deaf women, we have to acquire what the information is there. We need to work on prevention of these various types of abuse.
Very good summary of what services we need and how we need to go forward. Thank you. Let's go to the next question.
Deaf professionals who deal with deaf victims, do they do it in secret but active and visible in the deaf community?
Katrin, I see you're eager. Deaf professionals that work with deaf victims need to be trained ahead of time. So yes, we do have that, but they indeed need to be well trained. They also need to be trained on how to deal with the emotions that come up, to deal with their own emotions, how to make sure they can have professional distance. There are also severe cases of abuse that they will possibly encounter, that they need to make sure that everything stays anonymous and is confidential. Being a deaf woman, however, speaking to another deaf woman helps them open up. We notice that that is paramount in these situations. So even though they are a deaf person from the deaf community, with training, they can make sure that they can provide professional support. And once again, make sure that they take note of all of the services that they've provided and or the type of services, the type of victim that they have encountered. We have noted all this information, but we do not share this information in public. And like I said, I have met deaf clients, if you will, in the deaf community, at rallies, at gatherings, but I literally just meet them as if I don't know anything, that I've never met them. I have to make sure, and it's difficult. Maybe people think, what? I know her. How come she's ignoring me? And maybe I'll actually get a negative reputation, but I need to protect myself and them in the end to make sure that we are providing a professional service and so that they feel safe to be able to come to us when they're in need. It's definitely difficult in a small community, in a small deaf community. But it's important that we take this also into the educational realm for the deaf and make sure that everyone is aware of this. Alba?
Right. So as was just said, the deaf community is so small. And the sign language using community is a small community. People that are not deaf, they can use their spoken language and they have much more anonymity. But within the deaf community, we don't have that. So there are people that have come to see me, and then when we're out and about, others aren't aware of that service having been provided. So there's a benefit to deaf people being able to provide these services because we have similar experiences. And as was said, this education and training is really important. So training people on how to state their boundaries and respect those boundaries, right? Because you have this need to want to offer support as much as you can. And obviously people that are working in this field want to do as much as they can, but they also have to maintain their own mental health as they're interacting with victims of violence. But there is a way of showing empathy and displaying empathy and still providing the service and taking care of your own mental health as well as a service provider. So I imagine the issues that you go through, Catherine, are quite similar. So again, when somebody comes into our service, everything that is discussed is kept confidential, is not shared outside of the context. And when I see them out and about, I put my my outside off work hat on and I interact with them as if I've not met them and as if I don't know the information that I do know. And I carry on that way. And it's a difficult situation to be in. But in order to preserve all of our mental health, we have to carry on this way.
Those are very good points that you bring, Catherine and Alba. As a working professional, you have a lot of experience and you are able to separate your work from your private life. I think it's important that training looks at this and that there is sufficient training available for deaf professionals that provide this work. The deaf community is very small. Everyone knows each other. And that constant switching of hats is also draining, but you need to make sure that they can trust you 100%, not 99%, but that they can trust you 100%. And that is one very important aspect of this work when working with deaf victims. And only then you can take the next steps, but the very first point of contact is the most important. If a deaf victim feels that I can trust this person 100%, that is already such relief. And then they can take the next steps forward. So you guys are very experienced, but when you train your colleagues, you definitely have to make sure that they are just as well trained as you both. All right, should we go to the next question?
Are there any plans in the future to host an international domestic abuse conference?
Would anyone like to take this?
An international conference. I mean, that's an interesting idea. When I think about the hashtag Me Too movement, that became pervasive, right? Where because of technology and what that's allowed for, this hashtag Me Too was great. But how to be able to apply that to this idea, I don't know. It's something for EUD to consider maybe taking on, hosting a conference for this. It's definitely an important topic. And if they said yes, I'd love to work with them to make that happen.
Well, EUD can take that on board, and we see this as a proposal for a possible international conference. Catherine? if we're looking into the future, what I would like to see happen is what's happening here every year. That this is a yearly event, at least that we can start here, that on the 25th of November, every year on the International Day of Violence Against Women, that we can take this day and make sure that we can work also within our own countries and therefore be inspired for our work throughout the year. And that we can look at ways to prevent violence, domestic violence, all different types of violence, and also the variety of types of violence throughout Europe, also globally, internationally. WFD could also take this on, but trainings could also be a part of this. Lolo saying, what a great idea that we, from this day forward, make sure that we focus and have some attention on our webinar, at least for the 25th of November every year. Great idea. We will take that on board as well. We'll make a note of it. Yeah, food for thought.
You're thinking about it now, aren't you?
Great, let's look at the next question.
In France, you said that you have a shelter specifically for deaf women who are victims of domestic violence. How many people can you have in this support house?
Throughout France, there are women associations, so they're called women's houses in all regions of France. But it's not specifically for deaf. However, we have gone into these support houses where it's only for women. And so we've worked together with them. And so luckily, we have been able to share experiences, but it wasn't for the deaf. So currently, we hope maybe we could have some type of community-based services, but we wouldn't be able to have a shelter only for the deaf. But we can learn from their experiences. And so we've been welcomed and partnered with what it's called, the deaf houses, the support houses for women. And that is the cooperation that we've enjoyed. Step by step, we can set out these goals and see how we can achieve them. Great. Do we have the next question?
Do you have a guideline for deaf women in the safe house? Deaf women who have experienced domestic violence do have cultural differences from those who can hear.
Alba?
So the ALBA services that we provide, as I said before, it's not only victims that we support, it's their families as well. So whether it's hospitals or the police system, that we also offer training and support to in how to work with deaf victims of violence. Our main concern in all these scenarios is accessibility. So these guidelines that we're asked about, well, before the person makes the decision,
we have certain guidelines, and one of the very first guidelines is even before they meet the deaf victim, we tell them that having face-to-face contact is very important, and so we have certain guidelines that we have put together on how to communicate with a deaf victim. We make sure that they have very clear communication on their face, that they use their facial expression, that they don't expect that the person can definitely read or write, but check in if they can read or write, and that they can also communicate them. And just the important things that they have to consider when they meet a deaf victim. Yes, thinking about what you said, actually, we do have a certain, guide book for the police or for the hospital where they have certain guidelines or certain things they need to keep in mind when they are working with a deaf victim. For example, with the police, if they have a deaf woman coming in and being hysterical, they often don't take it seriously. So we have had some trainings, but also we've had a booklet that we used where we told them that if they wait 10 days, that it will take too long for the deaf person to feel that they've been taken seriously.
But they could be dead by then.
Indeed. So we make sure that, and so our association has been advocating for interpreting services. So at least that their services at the court or with the police, that an interpreter is called right away to make sure that that communication can at least communicated through an interpreter. So anytime that they are faced with a deaf client, patient, the like, we are advocating to at least make sure that their information is accessible. And then we can at least get to the next stage of providing more services.
Yeah, so in Spain, we've been working on this for a really long time, having a lot of conversations with the government about how to, in terms of gender equality, specifically to violence, and how to deal with this, right? And then we have coronavirus, which has added another layer of challenge to this, and more services are being used on the phone instead. Now, deaf women don't have access to this, so, and also the audio number that gets used for reporting domestic violence. We offer the interpreting services to have access to that. We want to make sure that these types of things are put into the law, and intersectionality is considered as well. So information for people that are working in various fields, whether they're police or psychologists or nurses and doctors. So providing information to all of those people, working with interpreters on how to be very clear in interpreting these types of interactions, right? The government is responsible for providing this education. It's a very difficult job to be interpreting in this scenario, right? So that information needs to be, and that training needs to be given. So the government does need to be giving more attention to domestic violence, specifically to deaf women who are experiencing this. And as I said earlier, in Spain, there's a lot of regional associations of the deaf throughout the country. And so there's a lot of conversations and a lot of meetings that need to take place throughout the country because services are decentralized. Yeah, it's really important that everybody sort of works together to come to a resolution.
So from what I'm understanding, it's indeed important to make sure you have gathered really clear guidelines and standards on how to work with deaf victims. And also to make sure that the deaf associations have a way to make sure that they can support these services locally and with the professionals. Maybe we can collect these different guidelines that exist and EUD can collect these best practices and look at them and share them with, it's getting quite late, so maybe let me look at the time and see if we have any more questions. Let's see what time it is. We still have 15 minutes left. Time is going quick. let's see, we can take a couple more questions and then we will go to the summary.
Could you tell us more about the Valencia Declaration from the first European Deaf Women Conference? Well, maybe EUD can explain that, actually.
I was thinking the same thing. However, Alba, maybe you can start and then I will add to that. You also were involved at great lengths.
Yeah, and it was really great work. Yeah, so it was a meeting of 3 days, a lot of discussion about various topics. And we created a declaration in Valencia.
Data.
On how necessary it is to collect data throughout the European nations about these issues. Women and children who are deaf, and the diversity amongst that population. And that every 2 years we want to see a forum. I'm not sure how to sign that. I'll sign it this way. A forum for deaf women to come together to work on topics that affect deaf women. We didn't get to do it this year because of the coronavirus, darn it. But hopefully we'll be able to do it before too long. We also said that EUD has to have a topic which focuses on this specifically. So it can't be just a one-off. It has to be something that's sustainable and that we continue to look at. That's the gist of it.
Yes, and the only thing that I would add to that is that EUD has now set up a gender equality committee, and that we had also shared this declaration in the General Assembly in 2018. And that EUD adopted this, signed it, and said that we will take on looking at research possibilities and how we can take steps to set up some type of research within the EU to look at gender issues and specifically look at deaf victims of domestic violence. We also wanted, from what I remember, set up a study on so we had, no, I'm forgetting what I want, exactly what I wanted to share. Within the Valencia Declaration, we also had certain themes that came up for the very first time, I believe, that when we had this seminar or forum, that there are many different forms of abuse. And they're also within the declaration said indeed that this should not be a one-off, that this was the very first forum, and that we wanted to make sure we had a second gathering, and that we wanted to make sure that this would expand and possibly go internationally as well. Catherine, did you want to add anything about future plans? I think now would be a good time for you to share future plans that you have. I'm not sure if I should say anything or keep it quiet or give you the floor. Yes, Alba said, oh, it's a pity the corona pandemic has messed up this possibility of coming together. However, 2021 in Paris, we will organize the next forum. We had about 250 women come together in 2018. And we indeed said we wanted a second gathering. Everyone pointed to me, so I took on the charge. And yes, in 2022 was too far away, and we had unfortunately missed it in 2020. So I took it upon myself to say that we will now be organizing something in 2021. It will be the 21st of October to the 24th of October in 2021. And maybe deaf people are like, woohoo, we get to go to Paris. But no, it will be a closed session for 2 days. National federations can come together, but I also would like to invite associations as well, so that we can work together, that any association, women's association, so like ALBA or the one that I'm working with, that we can come together with the Deaf Association, that we both go as representatives. So not just the Deaf Association, but that we work together so that we can make sure we can exchange information for our country. So we'll be a 2-day working group. We'll be focusing on empowerment, empowering women looking at themselves, reflecting, looking at situations of being a victim or working with victims. So that, as we had first time, that we will carry on doing. And then on the 23rd will be a series of lectures. And this will be open. And this will be open for all deaf women on the 3rd day. And on the 24th will be the last day when we will say farewell to our guests. Wonderful. Great. I hope you can find appropriate funding for this and make sure that this can happen. Maybe now with the Corona pandemic and funding, you can look to see if there's some additional funding to support this. Great. Catherine said, yep, we're working on it right now. All right, do we have enough time? Do we have a next question? Yes, we do.
When and where will the next European Deaf Women Conference take place?
Perfect. We've already answered that. So yes, now we know. As Catherine just shared, the 21st of October to the 24th. Is that correct? 21st to the 24th of October, 2021 in Paris. Well, this has not been officially published. We're still looking to see what the possibilities are, but something is being worked on. Great. So now we can look at the next question.
How can we find out more about the Justice Signs project?
Here it is. So you can see here is the website and the Twitter account. And there you can find more information about the Justice Signs 2 project. And EUD is also involved as well. So we also have some information on our EUD website as well, but if you want specific information about the Justice Signs project, that was the website. All right. We have 5 minutes left. Should we take on one more question or should we end it here? I'm being told that was the time that we had for the question answer session. Do you guys have any closing words that you would like to share with our viewers before we close the session today? Who would like to start? Alba, go ahead.
Yes, I want to emphasize 2 things in my closing. If there's a way to set up services via a website, it could take, I'm not sure what medium it would take, but for violence against deaf women, having an international support system, I'm wondering if EUD could serve as a contact point, or Katrin, what you think about supporting the idea of guidelines. I think that's really important to establish something with that. And then, secondly, violence against deaf women is not the responsibility of deaf women. It's everybody's responsibility to prevent these cases from happening, right? It's everybody's responsibility. Whether you're a man or a woman or deaf or not, preventing violence is everyone's job. Thank you.
Thank you. Katrien. Never stop fighting for deaf women's rights. Keep on fighting. And make sure you work with deaf professionals. If there's one piece of advice I can give is make sure that they are well-trained deaf professionals that can provide these services. Try and get government funding or any type of other funding. And also any interpreters that also want to work in this arena also need to be trained. And thirdly, make sure that you also work with a deaf relay interpreter. There are many situations where the deaf person does not understand what the hearing person is saying, and they do use a sign language interpreter, but that still doesn't always get the communication at par. So please work together in these sensitive situations to also work with a whole team and make sure that you work with the whole family and friends that are involved, and make sure that we work Europe-wide to support each other. And let's never be silent. Let's keep on fighting and be loud about this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for all your comments and your great talks. This is so much information that has been shared that we've been able to look a little deeper and share possible support forms, best practices, and also sharing on how you can take this step by step. Take it one barrier at a time, and when one door opens, you can then face the next door. We've also talked about how to make sure all the services and how they can be accessible. I see our time is up. I would just like to summarize what we've spoken about today. I think we all need to remember the International Day of Stopping Violence Against Women and Girls. And now we're looking at also specifically at deaf women, that the 25th of November, and this is first of many webinars to come, that we make sure that we have some type of event every 25th of November. This is what we take on from today. And also, that it's not only the responsibility of deaf victims to protect themselves, but it is everyone's responsibility. We need to look at how we can contact them, how we can arrange services, and make sure that we do this in the open. Make sure that it's talked about. Make sure that women feel that they can express themselves, that they have a platform. And all deaf girls as well. We've been talking about deaf women, but also deaf girls, that they see that this is being talked about, that they see that services are accessible, that they feel free to access these possibilities. And we need to make sure that we also work with the hearing movement as well, the women's movement, to make sure that we combat this all together. Thank you once again, Alba and Katrien, for your wonderful interventions. Thank you to the interpreters for your interpretation. And most importantly, thank you to all the viewers for attending today, taking this information on. And when you go back to your work, I hope that this has helped you find out how you can set up the next steps on whatever level of services you are now providing for deaf victims. Thank you.